The chains bit into Sarah's wrists as the transport van lurched to a stop. Through the reinforced window, she could see the towering concrete walls of Millfield Correctional Facility. Rising like gray tombstones against the stormy sky, the judge's words still rang in her ears. Guilty of treason against the United States of America. The gavel's crack had been the sound of her life shattering into 1,000 pieces. Smooth. It traitor spat the guard. As he yanked open the van door, the jeers began. Immediatelia, cacophony of whistles, catcalls and threats from the inmates. Pressed against their cell windows, this wasn't just any prison. Through a bureaucratic nightmare and overcrowding crisis, she'd been sentenced to a men's maximum facility. The first woman to ever walk through these gates as an inmate, Sarah kept her head high despite the chains, despite the shame burning in her chest. 10 years of service to her country, countless missions behind enemy lines, and now she was branded a terrorist because she'd refused to follow an illegal order. The irony tasted bitter as blood. The intake process was a blur of degradation, strip searches, delousing the rough hands of guards who seemed to take pleasure in her humiliation. But it was when they led her through the main corridor that everything changed. At the security checkpoint, a handler stood with his canine partner, conducting routine sweeps of incoming inmates. The dog was Magnificenta, German Shepherd with intelligent, amber eyes and a coat of black and tan that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. His name tag read Ranger, and he was clearly a veteran, his bearing as disciplined as any soldier Sarah had ever served with. As she approached, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the typical aggressive posturing she expected from a prison dog, Ranger sat perfectly still, his head tilted slightly to one side. Their eyes met across the chaos of the intake area, and time seemed to freeze. There was recognition. There's something deeper than human and animal. It was the look of one warrior acknowledging another, the silent communication of souls who had seen too much darkness and somehow survived it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as memories flooded back. Her own canine partner Duke, who had died saving her unit in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Keep moving, the guard barked, but Ranger didn't move. His handler, a grizzled man with sergeant's stripes tattooed on his forearm, tugged at the leash, confusion creasing his weathered face. Come on, Ranger, what's gotten into you, boy? But the dog's gaze never wavered from Sarah's face. In that moment, she understood something profound. Ranger saw past the orange jumpsuit, past the accusations and the chains. He saw the soldier she had been, the leader she still was deep inside, and she saw, in his steady, unwavering stare, a Omasesh wasn't alone in this hellholiest. They finally forced her to move on. Sarah glanced back, once Ranger was still sitting at perfect attention, watching her disappear into the depths of the prison. His handler shook his head, muttering something about the dog's strange behavior, but Sarah knew better. In a place where trust was currency and loyalty was scarce, she had just met the only creature who might understand what she was truly fighting for. Cell door slammed shut behind her with the finality of a coffin lid, but for the first time since the trial began, Sarah felt something other than despair. Somewhere in this concrete maze was a four-legged soldier who recognized her worth even when the rest of the world had written her off as a traitor. That night, as she lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, Sarah could still feel those amber eyes watching over her. She didn't know how or when, but she knew their paths would cross again. In the distance, she could hear the occasional bark echoing through the corridors. Ranger making his rounds, keeping the peace in his own way for the first time in months. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She had found an ally in the most unexpected place, and something told her that Ranger had found one too. The first week passed in a haze of barely controlled chaos. Sarah learned the unwritten rules quickly. Keep your mouth shut, your head down, and never show weakness. The other inmates circled her like sharks, testing her boundaries, probing for signs of the soft civilian they expected a terrorist to be. If they only knew the truth, thought she had commanded a Delta Force unit through some of the most dangerous missions in modern warfare. But that was a secret she would take to her grave. Every meal was a gauntlet of threats and propositions. Every trip to the yard required constant vigilance. The guards treated her with a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed hostility, as if her presence contaminated their domain. But it was during these early days that she began to notice Ranger's pattern. The canine unit made rounds throughout the sweeps, security checks, random searches without fail. Whenever Ranger passed near her, the dog would pause. His handler, Sergeant Martinez, would tug impatiently at the leash, but Ranger's attention remained fixed on Sarah, not with aggression or suspicion, but with something that looked disturbingly like expectation. "That dog's got a thing for you," sneered Blake, a lifer with arms covered in white supremacist tattoos who had made it his mission to make Sarah's life hell. "Maybe you've got something hidden." The guards missed. Terrorist. Sarah ignored him as she ignored all the taunts, but she couldn't ignore the growing certainty that Ranger was studying her, learning her patterns just as she was learning his during yard time when she did her solitary laps around the perimeter, a habit that kept her sane. And Battle Reddish would catch glimpses of the dog watching from the guard tower. His handler would be focused on scanning the crowd for contraband or brewing fights, but Ranger's eyes followed her with laser focus. It was on a Tuesday morning during what the inmates called Shake and Bakia. surprise cell inspection designed to find hidden weapons and drugs. That everything changed. Sarah was in the library, one of the few places where she could find some peace when the alarm sounded. Inmates were ordered to return to their cells. Immediately, while the canine units swept the facility, the chaos was immediate and predictable. Inmates scattered like roaches when the lights came on, some trying to ditch contraband, others simply running on pure prison instinct. Sarah moved with the crowd, but her training kicked in automatically. She assessed threats, identified escape routes, calculated response time, all the skills that had kept her alive in war zones were second nature. Now that's when she heard it. A sharp, commanding bark that cut through the noise like a blade. Not the aggressive snarling of a dog on the hunt, but something else entirely. It was the bark of a military working dog, giving a signal, the kind of communication she had heard 1,000 times in the field. Sarah stopped dead, causing inmates to bump into her from behind. Through the crowd she saw Ranger sitting at perfect attention in the middle of the corridor, his eyes locked on hers. Martinez was 20 feet away, shouting orders at another inmate, completely unaware of his dog's behavior. For a moment that seemed to last forever, it was just Sarah and Ranger, two warriors recognizing something in each other that no one else could see. Dog barked once more, crisp, controlled, purposeful. Then he did something that made Sarah's heart nearly stop. With his eyes still on her, Ranger performed a perfect about-face and sat down again, his back straight, his posture textbook military. It was a movement she had seen Duke perform countless times during missions, a signal that meant ready for orders. Move it, lady. A guard shoved her roughly toward her cell block, breaking the spell, but as she was herded away, Sarah's mind was racing. That bark, that posture. Ranger wasn't just any police dog. He was military trained, probably special operations, and somehow, in ways she couldn't explain, he recognized the same training in her. That night, lying on her bunk in the dark, Sarah allowed herself to remember Duke had been more than a partner. He had been her closest friend, her confidant, her early warning system in hostile territory. The bond between a handler and their canine was sacred, forged in trust, and sealed in shared danger. When an IED took Duke's life and shredded her leg, a part of Sarah had died with him, but now in this concrete hell, she was feeling something she thought was buried forever. Ranger wasn't just watching her, was waiting for her to remember who she was beneath the prison uniform, beneath the false accusations, beneath the weight of betrayal. If summoned by her thoughts, she heard the soft click of claws on concrete in the corridor outside. The night guard's radio crackled softly as he made his rounds, but there was another sound. Measured breathing of a large dog. Ranger was close, probably just outside her cell, making his own rounds. Sarah rolled over and whispered into the darkness, so softly that even she could barely hear it. I know, boy, I know. The footsteps paused for just a moment, and she could swear she heard a soft whine, quickly suppressed. Then the sounds moved on, but the message had been received. Somewhere in this place of concrete and steel, a warrior was waiting for his commander to remember who she was, and for the first time since her arrest, Commander Sarah Chen began to plan. 3 weeks into her sentence, the powder keg finally exploded. It started with the lights first flickering, then failing completely as the ancient electrical system finally gave up emergency lighting, cast everything in hellish red, and in that crimson twilight chaos erupted the Aryan Brotherhood. Had been planning this for weeks, waiting for the perfect storm of circumstances. They had men on the inside, guards who could be bought, and a plan to break out their leader who was being transferred to federal death row. In the morning when the power grid failed, they moved. Sarah was in her cell when the screaming started. The sound of steel on steel echoed through the corridors as makeshift weapons appeared from hiding places. The guards had never found emergency alarms wailed like banshees, but the electronic locks on the cell doors had defaulted to manual, and someone had keys. Her door swung open with a metallic clang, but Sarah didn't move. Years of combat experience had taught her to never rush into an unknown situation. She listened, cataloged the sounds, and began to build a mental map of the violence spreading through the prison like wildfire. Boots on metal stairs, guards retreating to secure positions, shouting in the yard and trying to scale the walls, and underneath it all, the desperate barking of a dog in distress. Ranger Sarah's blood turned to ice. The barking was wrong, not the controlled alerts of a working dog, but the frantic cries of an animal in mortal danger. She moved to her cell door and peered into the chaos through the smoke and flickering emergency lights. She could see bodies struggling in the main corridor. A group of inmates had cornered someone against the wall near the guard station. The barking grew more desperate, and Sarah saw him, Ranger, his leash tangled around a fallen piece of debris, unable to reach his handler who was on the ground, blood pooling beneath his head. 3 inmates surrounded them, led by Blake, the white supremacist who had made Sarah's life hell. One of them held a sharpened piece of metal clearly intended for Ranger's handler. For a split second, Sarah hesitated, revealing her combat skills would destroy her cover, potentially making her situation even worse. But as she watched Blake raise the improvised knife above the unconscious Martinez, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to watch another good soldier die while she did nothing. Sarah moved like liquid death through the shadows, her body remembering every lesson from 2 decades of warfare. Blake never saw her coming. One moment he was preparing to drive the shank into Martinez's chest, the next he was on his back, his wrist broken and the weapon spinning across the floor. His 2 companions spun toward her, but they were street fighters facing a Delta Force commander. The first one rushed her with a wild haymaker. Sarah ducked under his swing, drove her elbow into his solar plexus, and dropped him with a knee to the temple as he doubled over. The second inmate was smarter, tried to circle behind her, but Sarah had fought in places where a moment's inattention meant death. She spun, caught his wrist as he lunged with another shank, and used his momentum to slam him face first into the concrete wall. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. Blake groaned on the floor, clutching his shattered wrist while his accomplices lay unconscious. Sarah knelt beside Martinez, checking his pulse. Weak but steady, the bleeding was from a scalp wound that looked worse than it was. That's when she felt the wet nose against her hand. Ranger had managed to free himself from the tangled leash and now sat perfectly still beside her, his amber eyes bright with intelligence and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. For a moment in the chaos of the riot, it was just the two of them, 2 warriors who understood what it meant to protect their own. "Who are you?" Martinez whispered, his eyes fluttering open. Blood trickled down his forehead, but his gaze was sharp. "Aware. What do you say, boy?" Sarah asked softly. "Want to see what the world looks like on the outside?" Ranger's response was immediate and unmistakable. He rose to his feet, moved to Sarah's side, and sat at perfect attention, the posture of a soldier reporting for duty, but his amber eyes held something more than military discipline now. They held the warmth of a dog who had finally found his way home. As they walked through the prison gates together 1 hour later, Sarah felt the weight of injustice lifting from her shoulders like shackles falling away. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time in nearly a year, she was breathing free. Ranger trotted beside her, his head high and his step confident. No longer a prison dog, no longer bound by chains of duty to an institution. He was simply Ranger partner to Commander Sarah Chen, ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold behind them. The concrete walls of Millfield Correctional Facility grew smaller in the distance. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. They had found each other in the darkest place imaginable, forged a bond that transcended species and circumstance, and proven that sometimes justice wears a badge, sometimes it carries a gun, and sometimes it comes with 4 legs, a loyal heart, and the unshakable belief that the innocent deserve to be protected. As they reached the parking lot where Martinez waited to drive them to the nearest town, Sarah knelt down and looked Ranger in the eyes. "One last time. We did it, partner," she whispered. "We made it out." Ranger's tail wagged once, and in that simple gesture, Sarah heard the most important words any soldier could ever receive. Mission accomplished, ready for the next one together. They climbed into the vehicle and drove toward the horizon, to warriors who had found their way back to the light. The prison gates closed behind them with a finality that spoke of endings, but as Sarah watched the road stretch out ahead, she knew this wasn't really an ending at all. It was the beginning of something new. Author's note. This story explores themes of loyalty, justice, and redemption through the unlikely partnership between a wrongly imprisoned Delta Force commander and a military K-9 who recognizes her true nature. Set against the harsh backdrop of a maximum security prison, it examines how bonds forged in darkness can illuminate the path to freedom, and how sometimes the most profound connections transcend the barriers of species, circumstance, and institutional prejudice. You just did that. Wasn't luck. Before Sarah could answer, the sound of boots echoed down the corridor. The cavalry was en route, police in full gear, tear gas canisters ready. Sarah started to move away, to fade back into the shadows, but Ranger did something unexpected. The dog gently gripped her sleeve in his teeth, not biting, just holding her in place. Martinez struggled to sit up, one hand on his bleeding head, the other reaching for Ranger's collar, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. "I know what I saw," he said quietly, "and so does he." The riot police rounded the corner, their flashlights cutting through the smoke. In darkness, Sarah expected to be thrown to the ground, zip-tied and hauled off to solitary. Instead, Martinez struggled to his feet and pointed at Blake and his unconscious crewthies. "3 attacked me during the riot," he called out to the approaching officers. "Would have killed me if not for this inmate. She saved my life." Sarah stared at him in shock. He was protecting her, giving her cover for what she had done, but it was Ranger who provided the final touch. The dog moved to sit between Sarah and the approaching officers, his posture protective, his meaning unmistakable. In the strange logic of prison, a guard dog's loyalty carried weight that human testimony never could. The officers secured Blake and his crew. Martinez leaned close to Sarah, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "I don't know who you really are," he whispered, "but Ranger does, and that's good enough for me. Good enough for me." The riot was contained within 2 hours, but its effects would last much longer. Blake and his crew were hauled off to solitary, their escape plan in ruins. Martinez was treated for his injuries and returned to duty within days, and Sarah found that her position in the prison hierarchy had fundamentally shifted. The Other inmates looked at her with new eyes, now not as an easy mark, but as someone dangerous, someone to be respected or feared. The guards too treated her differently. Word had spread about what happened during the riot, and though the official report was sanitized, the truth had a way of traveling through the prison's informal networks. But it was Ranger's behavior that changed most dramatically during their daily encounters. The dog no longer just watched her with interest, now there was something deeper in his gaze: recognition, respect, and the beginning of trust. Sometimes when Martinez wasn't looking, Ranger would perform small gestures that only another soldier would understand. A slight tilt of the head that meant all clear, a position sit that provided tactical overwatch, or a soft whine that seemed to ask, "What are your orders?" Sarah began to understand that the riot had been a test not just of her skills, but of her character. Ranger had been evaluating her, measuring her worthiness, and she had passed. But with that acceptance came a new burden. The dog was beginning to see her as his true handler, the alpha he had been waiting for. The question was, what would she do with that loyalty? As she lay in her cell that night, Sarah could hear the soft padding of paws in the corridor as Ranger made his rounds. But now she noticed those rounds included lingering pauses outside her cell, as if the dog was standing guard over something precious. For the first time since her imprisonment began, Sarah allowed herself to think beyond survival. Ranger wasn't just recognizing her military background, was offering her partnership, loyalty, and perhaps, most importantly, hope in this place where humanity was systematically stripped away. A four-legged soldier was reminding her that she was still worth fighting. Fourth game was changing, and Sarah was beginning to remember how to play. The summons came 3 days after the riot, delivered by a nervous guard who couldn't quite meet Sarah's eyes. "Warden wants to see you." Now Sarah had been expecting this moment since the night she fought Blake and his crew. There was no way her combat skills could remain secret after such a display, and she had prepared herself for the consequences: solitary confinement, transfer to another facility, or worse, additional charges that could add years to her sentence. The walk to the warden's office took her through parts of the prison she had never seen. The administrative wing was quieter, cleaner, and felt almost civilized compared to the cell blocks. But what surprised her most was the presence of Sergeant Martinez and Ranger waiting in the hallway. Outside the warden's door, Martinez nodded to Hera, gesture of respect that spoke volumes about how their relationship had evolved. Ranger's reaction was more complex. The dog's tail wagged once quickly, suppressed, and his amber eyes tracked her every movement with an intensity that bordered on devotion. It was the look of a canine who had found his true handler, and Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Same feeling she had experienced with Duke years ago. "The warden will see you now," the secretary announced, and Sarah was escorted into an office that looked more like a corporate boardroom than a prison administrator's workspace. Behind a massive oak desk sat Warden James Blackwood, a man whose reputation preceded him, former military himself. Blackwood ran Millfield with an iron fist wrapped in bureaucratic velvet. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the warden's steely gazette, was Ranger lying calmly beside the desk, as if he belonged there. This wasn't a routine meeting. This was something else entirely. "Sit down, Ms. Chen," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Or should I say, Commander Chen. Sarah's blood ran cold. Her military rank wasn't part of her prison Firelight had been stripped along with her security clearance when she was convicted, but the slight smile on Blackwood's face told her that he knew exactly who she was. "I make it my business to know about my inmates," he continued, opening a thick file that Sarah recognized as her classified military record: Delta Force Silver Star recipient to Bronze Star's Purple Heart. Quite an impressive service record for a terrorist. "He was convicted by a jury of my peers," Sarah replied carefully, though her mind was racing. How had he obtained classified files? "You were railroaded by politicians who needed a scapegoat," Blackwood said bluntly. "I've read the real reports, Commander. What happened in Syria wasn't treason, it was good soldiers refusing to commit war crimes, but that's not why you're here." Sarah remained silent, but she noticed Ranger's ears perk up at the word commander, the dog's eyes fixed on her with renewed intensity, as if a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. Blackwood stood and walked to a wall-mounted map of the prison complex. 3 nights ago, you neutralized 3 armed inmates in under 30 seconds, using nothing but your hands. Textbook close quarters combat executed with surgical precision. Sergeant Martinez tells me, likely saved his life. I did what anyone would do. Sarah said. "Bullshit." Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip. "What you did was remind everyone in this facility that you're not just another inmate. You're a weapon that's been temporarily Felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you want, Warden?" Blackwood returned to his desk and activated a computer monitor facing away from Sarah. After a few keystrokes, he turned it around. The screen showed a grainy security camera image of a man with a scarred face and dead-eyed kind of eyes Sarah had seen in war zones belonging to men who had crossed lines they could never uncross. "This is Viktor Kozlov," Blackwood explained, "former Spetsnaz, currently serving life for murdering a federal judge. Last night, he escaped from the infirmary during the power outage. We think he's hiding in the old maintenance tunnels beneath the prison tunnels that haven't been mapped or maintained in decades. Sarah studied the photograph. Even in the poor image, she could see the predatory intelligence in Kozlov's features. This wasn't a common criminal. This was a trained killer. My guards are afraid to go down there, Blackwood continued, and frankly, I don't blame them. Those tunnels are a maze, and Kozlov has nothing to lose. He's already killed 2 guards during the escape, and intel suggests he's armed with weapons stolen from the armory, so call in a tactical team, Sarah suggested. I can't. Blackwood's jaw tightened. The state is already breathing down my neck about the riot. If word gets out that we've lost a cop killer in our own basement, they'll shut this facility down and scatter my staff to the winds. I need this handled quietly, quickly, and permanently. Sarah began to understand where this conversation was heading. You want me to go after him? I'm offering you a deal, Blackwood said. Bring back Kozlov Alvind. I'll reopen your case. I have contacts in the Justice Department, people who know the truth about what happened in Syria. They've been waiting for the right moment to act. The offer hung in the air like incense, sweet and intoxicating. Freedom, vindication, the chance to reclaim her life and her honor. But Sarah had learned not to trust gifts that came without strings. What's the catch? She asked. Blackwood smiled grimly. The tunnels are a death trap, unstable structure, no lighting, and multiple levels that connect to the old coal mine next door. If you get lost down there, we might never find your body, and if Kozlov gets the drop on you, he shrugged. Well, let's just say your chances of survival are not optimal. Sarah looked down at Ranger, who had been following the conversation with the intelligence of a human. The dog's eyes met hers, and in that amber gaze, she saw something that made her decision for her trust, loyalty, partnership. You'll do it, she said, but I have one condition. Blackwood raised an eyebrow. You're hardly in a position to make demands. Commander, I want him. Sarah pointed to Ranger. If I'm going into those tunnels, I'm going with a partner I can trust. The warden looked surprised, then thoughtful. He glanced at Martinez, who had been silent throughout the meeting. Sergeant, your canine has been acting strangely around the commander. Any thoughts on why? Martinez cleared his throat. Sir, Ranger is military-trained special operations. If I had to guess, he recognizes something in Commander Chemething. I saw during the riot they have the same instincts. Blackwood nodded slowly. Very well, you'll go down with Sergeant Martinez and his canine unit. No, Sarah said firmly. Just me and Ranger. More people mean more noise, more variables. This is a solo operation. Absolutely not. I'm not sending a convicted felon into armed confrontation without proper supervision. Sarah stood up, her military bearing asserting itself for the first time since her imprisonment. Warden, you asked me to handle a situation. Your trained guards can't manage either. You trust my judgment or you find another solution. But if you want Victor brought back alive, you let me do this my way. The room fell silent, except for the soft sound of Ranger's breathing. The dog had risen to his feet during Sarah's speech, positioning himself slightly in front of her in a protective stance that spoke volumes about where his loyalties lay. Finally, Blackwood nodded. 48 hours. If you're not back by then, I declare you both missing and presumed dead. The deal is off. Understood. Sarah looked down at Ranger, who met her gaze with absolute trust. When do we start? Now, Blackwood said, pressing a button on his desk. Martinez will get Ranger ready and brief you on the tunnel access points, Commander. He waited until she looked at him. Bring my dog back safely. He's one of the good ones. As they left the office, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Purpose for the first time since her conviction. She had a mission, a partner, and hope for redemption. But as they walked toward the tunnel entrance, one thought kept echoing. In her mind, Ranger wasn't the warden's dog anymore. Somehow, in the space of a single conversation, the magnificent canine had chosen his handler, and Sarah had accepted the responsibility that came with that loyalty. In the depths of the prison, a killer was waiting, but he wasn't the only predator preparing to hunt in the darkness below. The entrance to the maintenance tunnels was hidden behind a rusted steel door marked Authorized Personnel only in faded red letters. Sergeant Martinez led them through a maze of storage rooms and forgotten corridors to reach it, his flashlight cutting through the dusty air like a blade. The farther they went from the main prison, the more the building showed its age, crumbling concrete, exposed pipes, and the persistent smell of decay that spoke of decades of neglectless maintenance. Crew went down here in 1987, Martinez explained as he fumbled with an enormous ring of keys, found structural damage from the old mine workings, and sealed it up. But the riot damaged the electronic locks, and someone with the right knowledge could have picked the manual. When Sarah knelt beside Ranger, checking his tactical harness one final time, the K9 was equipped with a headlamp, radio collar, and protective gear that had been modified for the mission. More importantly, he was alert and focused, his entire body radiating the controlled tension of a soldier preparing for battle. How long since Kozlov went down? Sarah asked. 18 hours, give or take. Martinez finally found the right key, and the heavy door swung open with a groan that echoed into the darkness beyond. Long enough to find a good hiding spot, but not long enough to die of thirst. The smell hit them immediately, stagnant water, mold, and something else that made Sarah's nose wrinkle. Death. Something had died down there, and recently. Ranger's ears flattened against his head, and he let out a low whine that spoke of danger ahead. At last. Chance to back out, Commander Martinez said quietly. Nobody would blame you. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Tactical flashlight, zip ties, first aid kit, and a collapsible baton that Martinez had provided. Not much to face, a trained killer, but she had survived worse with less. What she really counted on was the four-legged soldier beside her whose loyalty had already been tested in blood and fire. See you in 48 hours. Sergeant Sarah said, then stepped into the tunnel. Ranger immediately moved to her left side, assuming the position that would give them both maximum tactical advantage. The door clanged shut behind them, and they were alone in the dark. Batista. Tunnels were worse than Sarah had imagined. The concrete walls wept moisture, and pools of black water reflected their lights. Like evil eyes, the air was thick and hard to breathe, filled with decades of accumulated dust and the sweet stench of rot. Every sound echoed strangely, making it impossible to judge distances or directions. But Ranger moved with confidence, his nose working constantly as he sorted through the complex scent picture. Within minutes, he had identified a trail and was leading Sarah deeper into the maze. The dog's training was extraordinary, moved silently despite the wet conditions, paused at every intersection to clear potential ambush points, and communicated through subtle body language that spoke of elite military conditioning. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Ranger suddenly froze, his ears snapping to attention. Sarah immediately dropped to one knee, switching off her light and listening intently. In the distance, she could hear something that made her blood run cold. The soft whimpering of someone in pain, moving by feel and instinct. Sarah followed Ranger through a series of turns that led to a wider chamber. Here her light revealed something that stopped her heart. A young corrections officer, barely out of his teens, tied to a support beam with his own duty belt. His face was swollen and bloody, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. Officer Mitchell. Sarah remembered him from the yard rotations. He was one of the few guards who had treated her with basic human dignity, never joining in the casual cruelty that passed for normal behavior in the prison. And now he was bait in a trap that Sarah was walking into with her eyes wide open. Ranger's low growl warned her a split second before the attack came. Sarah threw herself sideways as a piece of rebar whistled through the space where her head had been. Viktor Kozlov emerged from the shadows like a nightmare, made flesh bigger than his photo had suggested, moving with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known defeat. Commander Sarah Chen, he said in accented English, his voice carrying the cultured tone of someone who had received an excellent education before choosing a life of violence. Your reputation precedes you, though I must admit, I expected someone more impressive. Sarah circled slowly, keeping the baton ready, while Ranger positioned himself for a flanking attack. Let the kid go, Victor, this is between us. Between us. Kozlov laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The boy. He is merely insurance, though I confess I am curious about your four-legged companion. Spetsnaz training teaches us to recognize quality, and that animal moves like one of our own war dogs. As if summoned by the words, Ranger's posture shifted subtly, his hackles rose, his lips pulled back to reveal gleaming fangs, and his eyes locked onto Kozlov with predatory focus. This wasn't just territorial aggression, it was personal. Ranger recognized the type of human who had caused him pain in the past, and every instinct in his body was screaming for justice. You made a mistake coming down here alone. Kozlov continued, hefting the rebar like a club in the darkness. All your American technology means nothing down here, only the strong survive. Right about one thing, Sarah replied, her voice deadly calm. I'm not alone. She gave Ranger the hand signal for attack. A gesture the dog recognized despite never having trained with her. Years of military conditioning took over, and Ranger moved like liquid lightning. Kozlov spun to face the dog, raising the rebar defensively, but he had never fought a military K9 before. Ranger didn't charge blindly. Feinted left, then dove right, his jaws clamping down on Kozlov's wrist with bone-crushing force. The killer screamed and dropped his weapon, but his training kicked in. Instead of trying to pull away from the dog, he drove his knee upward, trying to break Ranger's ribs, but Sarah was already moving. The baton caught Kozlov across the back of his skull with a wet crack, and he crumpled to his knees. Ranger released his grip and backed away, blood on his muzzle, but eyes still bright and alert. Kozlov swayed but didn't foul. His skull was apparently as thick as his reputation suggested. He looked up at Sarah with something that might have been respect. Well played, Commander, but this is not finesse. Yes, it is, Sarah said quietly, zip-tying his hands behind his back with practiced efficiency. You're going back upstairs to face justice. Officer Mitchell gets medical attention, and I get my life back. As she knelt to check on the young guard, Sarah felt Ranger's wet nose against her hand. The dog was offering comfort, reassurance, and something to unshakable bond between warriors who had faced death together and emerged victorious. In his amber eyes, she saw not just loyalty but love. Officer Mitchell was alive, but needed immediate medical attention. Sarah activated the radio collar around Ranger's neck and called for extraction within hours. Medical teams had stabilized the young guard and transported Kozlov back to solitary confinement. 3 days later, Sarah sat in Warden Blackwood's office once again, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Her prison uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, and the papers on his desk bore the official seals of the Department of Justice. Your conviction has been overturned, Blackwood announced, full pardon with prejudice. The real evidence from Syria has finally come to light, and certain individuals are facing court-martial for attempting to frame you. Sarah nodded, feeling strangely empty. After months of fighting for this moment, the victory felt anticlimactic. What happens now? That's up to you, Blackwood said. The army would be happy to have you back with full restoration of rank and benefits. Or you could take the civilian route. I know several security firms that would pay handsomely for your expertise. Looked down at Ranger, who lay contentedly at her feet, the dog's official handler. Martinez had been present for the debriefing, but it was clear to everyone in the room where Ranger's loyalties truly lay. There is one other matter, Blackwood continued. Ranger is officially retiring from active duty. 8 years of faithful service, multiple commendations, and frankly, Martinez agrees that the dog has chosen his next assignment. He slid a folder across the desk. Adoption papers. He's yours if you want him. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since her arrest. She reached down to scratch Ranger behind the ears, and his tail thumped against the floor with unmistakable joy.